let's conclude with the final topic of freedom of speech, freedom of opinion. I've read a number of passages from various encyclicals of the 19th century on this topic. I believe in Mirari Vos, there's one as well, but he addresses it here in Immortale Dei, and he has a couple of paragraphs on free speech. In some ways, just as an aside, I think even more than the teaching on the confessional state, this is the one that has the most immediate contradiction, perhaps, with the U.S. Constitution, because, after all, Leo allows for situations where it may not be prudent for the state to, be a fully confessional state. But this free speech thing, I believe, aside from matters of heresy, is more a matter of the natural law. So this could be a real problem unless you allow for the state's ability to regulate these things, even if the federal government doesn't. But anyway, so let me read this passage. I think this is the second passage on free speech in Immortale Dei. The liberty of thinking and of publishing whatsoever each one likes without any hindrance is not in itself an advantage over which society can wisely rejoice. On the contrary, it is the fountainhead and origin of many evils. Moving ahead a little bit. If the mind assents to false opinions and the will chooses and follows after what is wrong, neither can attain its native fullness, but both must fall from their native dignity into an abyss of corruption. Whatever, therefore, is opposed to virtue and truth may not rightly be brought temptingly before the eye of man, much less sanctioned by the favor and protection of the law.
Yeah, this is not how one normally understands things within the United States, I think. Look, the declaration, which obviously is concerning religious liberty, is quite hot on the importance of people attaining the truth without being disturbed by coercion. And you have in Leo XIII what's clearly a very different attitude, which actually coercion has a legitimate use to prevent people being seduced by error. So we limit, what can be published, what can be taught in the schools, what people even can say in public places. And that obviously is so illiberal, it seems to us now. Now, the Declaration is obviously specifically ruling out interference in expression of religious matters in the civil order, and we've already got a story about why that would apply. It's interesting that even the Declaration, though, emphasises that there is an exception. The state can interfere in religious liberty by implication, including with speech and inquiry, if necessary to preserve just public order, which of course they very carefully insist doesn't involve a specifically religious good, but it involves the civil order that the state is supposed to be protecting. But of course, there is an analogy here. We could look at heresy laws or apostasy laws as protecting the equivalent of just public order within the community of the church. The good of the community of the church depends on committed faith. And people just treat the faith as something you can say anything about whatsoever, or just walk away from when you feel like it without any kind of penalty, then the community of the church may not survive. That's a way of looking at it. And obviously, Dignitatis Humana says nothing about that because it's not addressing the community of the church. But there is an issue to do with coercive authority in general, which the rather liberal rhetoric of the Declaration and natural liberal understanding that you might get looking at the American Constitution or at John Stuart Mill's On Liberty or things like that. There is a whole set of questions about restriction of speech and expression which raise quite issues about the nature of coercive authority as such. Nowadays, we tend, if we're brought up as liberals, as we all have been, you and I were both probably taught all this stuff in various ways, John Stuart Mill and the rest, to think that what coercive authority is about protecting various kinds of external attack, like theft, and misapplication of taxation, denial of goods that we might otherwise have needed, interference with property, attacks on the person, all that sort of stuff. It's quite wrong for coercive authority to bother itself with what goes on in our heads. So coercive authority is about regulating external goods of a vital nature. That's really what it's about. If you look at Aristotle or medieval Catholic political theory, it's very clear that what coercive authority, including the authority of the state, is about preserving, amongst other things, not just virtue in the public sphere, but a community, related to that, a community of shared ethical belief. And so the coercive authority is a teacher. And it uses threats of punishment to get the right ideas into people's heads, partly by using threats of punishment to direct their attention to arguments they might not have been attending to. So, threats of punishment for theft are about other things besides just stopping you actually stealing. They're also about getting you to understand the value of property rights.
Right.
Obviously, actually, that must be right. If people refrain from theft simply to avoid the penalties, just as penalties, you'd have to have an amazingly large police service. You want most people to refrain from theft because they believe in property and respect property rights.
Right.
Now, in that context, all states are actually in the business of using coercive penalties to dictate the nature of people's beliefs. And that's why you'll notice that, for example, very few states, I think, tolerate for any length of time serious public pluralism about family structure. If they don't restrict free expression directly through speech laws, and they won't do that, they will use their links with other institutions of civil society, like the university system and who gets grants, etc., to shut various things down. I remember going to another British university and asking, would it be all right? I was at a friend's inaugural lecture, and I said, look, I'm a professor of moral philosophy. Would it be all right if I gave a series of lectures in your university discussing various possible forms of family structure? And having discussed all the, alternatives, gay relationships, polygamy, you name it, the works, I suddenly said, look, here's some arguments for why natural law, heterosexual monogamy is the right family structure. Could I do that? And I've done it with all the arguments. I'm giving everyone a fair view of all the debate. They said, no, we'd have to shut you down. The head of the School of Humanities of this university, who'd had a bit to drink by this stage, was rather frank, said, of course we'd shut you down. Gosh, but we can't actually do that. Any more than the 19th century, I could have done a course in favour of gay marriage at a Victorian university. I'd have been shut down.
Right.
So to be honest, I think the same would be true in the United States, is the First Amendment notwithstanding, pressure would have been brought. So all these societies use various forms of coercive authority and its links with the rest of civil society to control opinion in certain vital areas of human life. And it seems to me that someone like Leo XIII is much more realistic about this.
Sure, yeah.
than people are now. And there isn't really such a thing as a liberal state, if you mean by that a state that doesn't do that. The only difference is states that admit they do it and states that do it without admitting that they do it.
That's right. So, I think we can say at the very least, you can't permit... it's madness for a state to permit speech that goes against the very existence of society. So I think that according to church teaching on freedom of opinion, I think that the writings of Karl Marx, just to use a really obvious example, would have to be banned. And I've discussed these things with some good people who tend to be a little bit more of the neoconservative or whatever you want to call it bent, and they'll say, they'll kind of dismiss and say, the church doesn't have an index anymore. Well, that's not really a serious objection. We had an Avignon papacy too, but to assume that now we're in this new paradigm where the church can no longer ever, much less the state. The church itself is no longer going to list books and threaten the faithful with punishments if they read them for their own good. That's not a serious argument to simply say, well, at this moment we don't have an index. I mean, we're
well. Here's an analogy. Leaving Marx aside, he has too many supporters in most elite secular elites or sympathisers to ban him successfully. But take someone less loved, that possibly comparable in certain respects. Take our old friend Adolf. I went and opened up a booth in a street in a city in Germany to sell copies of Mein Kampf. I'd be shut down Toronto.
That's right.
To be honest, I think that would happen if I did it in Oxford Street in London, actually. Mm-hmm. And as we know, in Germany there are Holocaust denial laws. It can be a crime to go around denying the Holocaust happened.
That's right.
Now, I don't criticise these laws at all. They're very understandable. But that shows you that any state, and of course in Germany for very good reasons, they're particularly worried about events in the mid-20th century and never want that repeated. Any state will prevent what would now be called forms of hate speech and publication. There'll be local cultural, barriers to doing it one way or another, but we're just discussing the boundaries, not the principle.